Hey guys, all right, here is chapter 4, 5, and 6 of, where'd it go? The BFG. All right, so Sophie, when we last saw her, was wrapped up in the blanket, and the BFG was striding across the land. Very big strides, very big steps. Now that brings us to chapter 4. Where were they headed? As you can see on page 20, the title of this chapter is The Cave. The giant ran on and on, but now a curious change took place in his way of running. He seemed suddenly to go into a higher gear. Faster and faster he went, and soon he was traveling at such a speed that the landscape became blurred. The wind stung Sophie's cheeks. It made her eyes water. It whipped her head back and whistled in her ears. She could no longer feel the giant's feet touching the ground. She had a weird sensation they were flying. It was impossible to tell whether they were over land or sea. This giant had some sort of magic in his legs. The wind rushing against Sophie's face became so strong that she had to duck down again into the blanket to prevent her head from being blown away. Was it really possible that they were crossing oceans? Well, it certainly felt that way to Sophie. She crouched in the blanket and listened to the howling of the wind. It went on for what seemed like hours. Then all at once, the wind stopped its howling. The pace began to slow down. Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding once again over the earth. She poked her head up and out of the blanket to have a look. They were in a country of thick forests and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down and was now running more normally, although normal was a silly word to use when describing a galloping giant. He leaped over a dozen rivers. He went rattling through a great forest, then down into a valley and up over a range of hills as bare as concrete. Ooh, simile. And soon he was galloping over a desolate wasteland that was not quite of this earth. The ground was flat and pale and yellow. Great lumps of blue rock were scattered around, and dead trees stood everywhere like skeletons. Simile. The moon had long since disappeared, and now the dawn was breaking. All right, so it's morning time. The dawn is breaking, means the sun is coming up. Sophie, still peering out from the blanket, saw suddenly ahead of her a great craggy mountain. The mountain was dark blue, and all around it the sky was gushing and glistening with light. Bits of pale gold were flying among delicate, frosty white flakes of cloud, and over to one side, the rim of the morning sun was coming up, red as blood. Simile. Right beneath the mountain, the giant stopped. He was puffing mightily. His great chest was heaving in and out. He paused to catch his breath. Directly in front of them, lying against the side of the mountain, Sophie could see a massive round stone. It was as big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side as easily as if it had been a football. And now, where the stone had been, there appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large the giant didn't even have to duck his head as he went in. He strode into the black hole, still carrying Sophie in one hand, the trumpet and suitcase in the other. As soon as he was inside, he stopped and turned and rolled the great stone back into place so that the entrance to his secret cave was completely hidden from the outside. Now that the entrance had been sealed up, there was not a glint of light inside of the cave. All was black. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground. Then the giant let go of the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away. Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. He's getting ready to eat me, she told herself. He'll probably just eat me raw, just as I am. Oh, or perhaps he will boil me first. Oh, or he'll have me fried. He will drop me like a rasher of bacon into some gigantic frying pan sizzling with fat. A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked and stared. She saw an enormous cavern with a high, rocky roof. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and on the shelves there stood row upon row of glass jars. There were jars everywhere. They were piled up in the corners. They filled every nook and cranny of the cave. In the middle of the floor there was a table 12 feet high and a chair to match. The giant took off his black cloak and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw that under the cloak he was wearing a sort of collarless shirt, like a shirt without a collar, and a dirty old leather waistcoat that didn't seem to have any buttons. Hey guys, a waistcoat is a vest. You know what I mean? So think about what he's wearing. He's wearing a collarless shirt, so it's not like a church shirt or anything like that. It's not quite like a t-shirt. It's like a cross between a button-down shirt and a t-shirt. So he's wearing that. He's got this vest or this waistcoat on over it. And then he had been wearing a big, long cloak, kind of like a cape with shoulders. I can picture it. Can you? So there we are, the bottom of page 24 in that final paragraph. He was wearing a sort of collarless shirt and a dirty old leather waistcoat that didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers, or his pants, were faded green and were far too short in the legs. On his bare feet, he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that, for some reason, had holes cut along each side, with a large hole at the end where his toes stuck out. Sophie, crouching on the floor of the cave in her nightie, gazed back at him through thick, steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind. And a finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine. Think about that. What figure of speech is that? A finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine. Is that onomatopoeia? Nope. Is it a simile? Nope. Is it, what is that called when you give human characteristics to something that is not human? I know. Personification. Boom. I bet I beat you to it. Did I beat you to it or did you beat me? I don't know. I don't trust you. All right. Final paragraph. Ha! Shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. What has us got here? His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. Page 25. The chapter is called The BFG. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. Oh, well, now he's really going to eat me, Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from his head as he wished. I is hungry, the giant boomed. He grinned, showing massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. Please don't eat me, Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. Just because I is a giant, you think I is a man-gobbling cannibal. You was about right. Giants is all cannibally and murderful.
and they does gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere around. Out there has the famous blood-crunching giant. Bone-crunching giant, I mean. He crunches up 2 wopsy-whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-bursting. Noise of crunching bones goes crackety-crack for miles around.
Ouch, Sophie said.
Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings from turkey, the giant said. Every night, Bone Cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble Turks.
Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark that she became quite angry. "Well, why Turks?" she blurted out. "What's wrong with the English?"
Bone-crunching giant says Turks is tasting oh so ever much juicier and more scrumdiddlyumptious. Bone Cruncher says Turkish human beings has a glamourly flavor. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of turkey.
"Oh, well, I suppose they would," Sophie said.
Of course they would, the giant shouted. Every human being is diddly and different. Some is scrumdiddlyumptious and some is ucky slush. Greeks is all full of ucky slush. No giant is ever eating Greeks, ever.
"Why not?" Sophie asked.
Greeks from Greece is all tasting greasy, the giant said.
Well, I imagine that's possible too," Sophie said. She was wondering with a bit of tremble what all this talking about eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with this peculiar giant and smile at his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite about talking about food.
As I am saying, the giant went on, all human beings is having different flavors. Human beings from Panama is tasting very strong of hats.
Hey guys, there's something called a Panama hat. It's kind of similar to what Indiana Jones wore. That kind of hat with a large brim around it. Keeps the sun out of your eyes. And so he's saying people from Panama taste very strong of hats. Panama hats. "Why hats?" Sophie said.
You is not very clever, the giant said, moving his great ears in and out. I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bundongle.
A bundongle. That's funny to me. Sorry. Do you like vegetables? Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation towards a slightly less dangerous kind of food.
You is trying to change the subject, the giant said sternly. We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of the human being. The human being is not a vegetable.
But the bean is a vegetable, Sophie said.
Not the human being, the giant said. The human being has 2 legs and a vegetable has no legs at all.
Sophie didn't argue anymore. The last thing she wanted to do was make a giant cross. Cross means angry. The human being, the giant went on, is coming in dillions of different flavors. For instance, human beings from Wales is tasting very whooshy of fish. There is something very fishy about Wales. You mean whales, Sophie said. Wales is something quite different. Okay, W-H-A-L-E-S, whales, that's a big thing in the ocean. W-A-L-E-S is an island off the coast of Great Britain off of England, and it's the name of a country. So he's getting the big, giant, aquatic animal mixed up with a country.
Wales is Wales, the giant said. Don't gobble funk around with words. I will now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey has a most disgustable woolly tickle on the tongue, the giant said. Human beings from Jersey is tasting of cardigans.
You mean jerseys, Sophie said.
Once again, you are once again gobble funking, the giant shouted. Don't do it. This is a serious and snitching subject. May I continue?
I'm sorry, it's funny. Oh, please do, Sophie said.
Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs.
Oh, of course, Sophie said. Oh, they taste of Great Danes. I get it.
Wrong!
Cried the giant, slapping his thighs.
Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they is tasting of Labradors.
Then what do the people of the country of Labrador taste of? Sophie asked.
Danes!
The giant cried triumphantly.
Great Danes!
Aren't you getting a bit mixed up? Sophie said.
I is a very mixed up giant, the giant said. But I does do my best, and I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know one who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper.
Wellington? Sophie said. Where is Wellington?
Ah! Your head is full of squashed flies, the giant said. Wellington is in New Zealand. The human beings in Wellington has an especially scrumdiddlyumptious taste. So says the welly-eating giant.
Well, what do the people of Wellington taste of? Sophie asked.
Boots,
the giant said. Oh, of course, Sophie said. I should have known. Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over and done with right away than be kept hanging around any more. What kind of human beings do you eat? She asked, trembling.
Me?
Shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars rattle on their shelves.
Me gobbling up human beings. This I never. The others, yes. All the others is gobbling them up every night. But not me. I is a freaky giant. I is a nice and jumbly giant. I is the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. I is the big friendly giant. I is the BFG. What is your name?
My name is Sophie, Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news that she just heard. One more chapter, guys. All right, take a deep breath. Woo! How funny is that giant? It's cracking me up. And Sophie, being so brave, there in the face of adversity. Very funny. Page 31, The Giants. But if you are so nice and friendly, Sophie said, then why did you snatch me from my bed and run away with me?
Because you saw me, the big friendly giant answered. If anyone is ever seeing a giant, he or she must be taken away hip switch.
Why? asked Sophie.
Well, first of all, said the BFG, human beings is not really believing in giants, is they? Human beings is not thinking we exist.
Oh, I do, Sophie said.
But that's just because you has seen me, cried the BFG. I cannot possibly allow anyone, even little girls, to be seeing me and staying at home. The first thing you would be doing would be scuttling around, yodeling the news that you are actually seeing a giant. And then the great giant hunt, the mighty giant look-see, would be starting up all over the world, with the human beings all rummaging for the great giant you saw and getting wildly excited. People would be coming rushing and bushing after me with goodness knows what, and they would be catching me and locking me into a cage to be stared at. They would be putting me in the zoo or the bunkum house with all of those squiggling hippo dumplings and crocodile dillies.
Sophie knew what the giant said was true. If any person reported actually having seen a giant haunting the streets of a town at night, there would most certainly be a terrific hullabaloo across the world.
I will bet you, the BFG went on, that you would have been splashing the news all over the wonky world, wouldn't you, if I hadn't wiggled you away?
I suppose I would, Sophie said.
And that would never do, said the BFG.
So what will happen to me now? Sophie asked.
If you do go back, you will be telling the world, said the BFG. The most likely on the telly bunkum box.
What do you think that is? Yeah, TV.
And the radio squeaker.
The radio speaker.
So you would just have to be staying here with me for the rest of your life.
Oh no, cried Sophie.
Oh, yes, said the BFG. But I am warning you not to ever go whiffling about out of this cave unless I is with you, or you will be coming to an ucky-mucky end. I is showing you now who is going to eat you up if they is ever catching one little glimpse of you.
The big, friendly giant picked Sophie off of the table and carried her to the cave entrance. He rolled the huge stone to one side and said, "Peep out over there, little girl, and tell me what you is seeing." Sophie, sitting on the BFG's hand, peeped out of the cave. The sun was now up and shining fiery hot over the great yellow wasteland with its blue rocks and dead trees.
"Is you seeing them?" the BFG asked.
Sophie, squinting through the glare of the sun, saw several tremendous tall figures moving along among the rocks about 500 yards away. 3 or 4 others were sitting quite motionless on the rocks themselves.
"This is giant country," the BFG said. "Those is all giants, every one."
It was a brain-boggling sight. The giants were all naked except for a sort of short skirt around their waists, and their skins were burnt brown by the sun. Okay, laugh it up, ha ha ha. But anyway, you can picture them. But it was the sheer size of each one of them that boggled Sophie's brain most of all. They were simply colossal. That means huge. Far taller and wider than the big friendly giant upon whose hand she was now sitting. Oh, and how ugly they were! Many of them had large bellies. All of them had long arms and big feet. They were too far away for their faces to be seen clearly, and perhaps that was a good thing. "What on earth are they doing?" Sophie asked.
"Nothing," said the BFG. "They is just mootling and footling around and waiting for the night to come. Then they will all be galloping off to places where people is living to find their suppers."
"You mean to Turkey?" Sophie said.
"Well, bone-crunching giant will be galloping to Turkey, of course," said the BFG. "But the others will be whiffling off to all sorts of flung-away places like Wellington for the booty flavor and Panama for the hattie taste. every giant is having his own favorite hunting ground.
Well, do they ever go to England? Sophie asked.
Oh, often, said the BFG. They say the English is tasting ever so wonderfully of cod scallop.
I'm not sure I quite know what that means, Sophie said.
Meanings is not important, said the BFG. I cannot be right all the time. Quite often, I is left instead of right.
See what he did there? He's not wrong, he's left. So he's, instead of being wrong, he's left. So right and left. Funny. Top of page 35. And are all those beastly giants over there really going off again tonight to eat people? Sophie asked.
All of them is guzzling human beings every night, the BFG answered. All of them excepting me. That is why you will be coming to an ucky-mucky end if any of them should ever be getting his gogglers upon you. You would be swallowed up like a piece of frumpkin pie, all in one dollop.
But eating people is horrible, Sophie cried. Well, it's frightful. Why doesn't someone stop them?
And who, please, is going to be stopping them? Asked the BFG.
Well, couldn't you? Said Sophie.
Never in a pig's whistle, cried the BFG. All of those man-eating giants is enormous and very fierce. They is all at least 2 times my wideness and double my royal highness.
Funny. Twice as high as you? Cried Sophie.
Easily that, said the BFG. You was seeing them in the distance, but just wait till you get them close up. Those giants is all at least 50 feet tall, with huge muscles, and cockles alive, oh! I is the titchy one. I is the runt. 24 feet is puddle nuts in giant country.
Oh, well, you mustn't feel bad about it. I think you're just great. Why, even your toes must be as big as sausages.
Bigger, said the BFG, looking pleased. They is as big as bumblehammers.
How many giants are out there? Sophie asked.
9 altogether, answered the BFG.
That means, said Sophie, that somewhere in the world, every single night, 9 wretched people get carried away and eaten alive.
Oh, more, said the BFG. It is all depending, you see, on how big the human beings is. Japanese beans is very small, so a giant will need to gobble up about 6 Japanese before he is feeling full up. Others, like the Norway people and the Yankee Doodles, that's the Americans, is ever so much bigger, and usually 2 or 3 of those makes a good tuck in.
But do these disgusting giants go to every single country in the world? Sophie asked.
Well, all countries excepting Greece is getting visited sometime or another, the BFG answered. The country which a giant visits is depending on how he is feeling. If it is very warm weather and a giant is feeling as hot as a sizzle pan, he will probably go galloping far up to the Frisbee North to get himself an Esquimau or 2 or to cool him down. A nice fat Esquimau to a giant is like a lovely ice cream lolly to you.
Well, I'll take your word for it, Sophie said.
And then again, if it is a frosty night and the giant is frigiding with cold, he will probably point his nose towards the sweltering hot lands to guzzle a few Hottentots to warm him up.
How perfectly horrible, Sophie said.
Nothing hots a cold giant like a hot Hottentot, the BFG said.
And if you were to put me down on the ground and I was to walk out among them, Sophie said, would they really eat me up?
Like a whiff-swiddle, cried the BFG. And what is more, you is so small, they wouldn't even have to chew you. The first one to be seeing you would pick you up in his fingers and down you go like a drop of drain water.
Let's go back inside, Sophie said. I hate even watching them. And there you have it, friends. That is where we stop. I'd like for you now, look on your Google, see if there is a quiz. If there is not a quiz, that means that I didn't get it sent in time. I'm sorry. But what I'd like for you to do is now move on to your small reading group activity. Thanks, you guys. Good night.